having been given a big target by Alex Stock, Friday played Barrow, and we beat them 3-0 at Kenilworth Road, and I didn't score. I made 2, but that was no good. I had a target of goals to score, and I hadn't scored. And there was now only 45 games left, and I still had this huge total score, and a bit of panic sets in.
Before we begin, if you enjoy deep, honest football stories that go beyond goals and trophies, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps keep these stories alive, because some football journeys don't end. With retirement applause, they continue in silence, pain, and struggle. Malcolm Macdonald's story is one of those journeys, a life that reached incredible heights, fell into darkness, and then found its way back through sheer resilience. When Malcolm Macdonald walked away from football in 1979, he was only 29 years old. For most players, retirement comes gradually, with warning signs and time to prepare. For Macdonald, it arrived suddenly and brutally. One moment he was leading the line for Arsenal, still feared for his power and instinct, and the next his body simply refused to cooperate. The knee injury he suffered in a League Cup match against Rotherham was not just another knock. It was the beginning of a lifetime of pain that would follow him long after the crowd stopped chanting his name. Inside football, pain had always been managed. In that protected environment, medication was immediate, treatment was constant, and the expectation was to play through discomfort. But once he stepped outside that bubble, reality hit hard. The National Health Service could not offer the same, the level of ongoing care, and slowly, almost invisibly at first, his knee deteriorated. Osteoarthritis set in, and the pain was no longer something that arrived only on match days. It became permanent, invasive, and overwhelming. Macdonald later described the pain in haunting terms. He said it felt like a sledgehammer smashing into his brain, again and again, without warning. It wasn't pain that could be distracted away. It interrupted thoughts, conversations, even moments of stillness. He spoke of sitting in his living room watching television and suddenly being reduced to tears, not from emotion, but from agony. For a man who once thrived on physical dominance, being unable to control his own body was a cruel psychological blow. As the years passed, the physical suffering began to erode other parts of his life. Confidence faded, purpose blurred. Football had given him structure, identity, and a sense of belonging. Without it, days stretched endlessly, and pain-filled the gaps where meaning once lived. Like many former players of his era, he was unprepared for the emotional aftermath of retirement, especially one forced so early in the early 1990s. Macdonald moved to Italy hoping distance might offer a fresh start. Instead, it became the setting for his lowest point. Away from familiar faces and support systems, his personal life began to unravel rapidly. A business venture failed, and with it went financial stability. Bankruptcy followed, stripping away not only money but dignity. Soon after, his second marriage collapsed, leaving him emotionally isolated at a time when he was already fragile. With pain as his constant companion and stress closing in from every direction, Macdonald searched desperately for relief. He found it, at first, in whiskey. What began as an attempt to dull the physical agony quickly transformed into dependence. Alcohol became his painkiller, his escape, and eventually his prison. The amounts escalated frighteningly fast. At his worst, he was consuming up to 3 bottles of whiskey a day. Even then, he was aware of what he was doing to himself. He later admitted that he knew he was slowly committing suicide, and that awareness, however, didn't stop him. Addiction rarely listens to logic. Each drink offered temporary numbness, and in a life defined by relentless pain, temporary relief felt like survival. By the mid-1990s, the situation was unsustainable. His health deteriorated, relationships fractured further, and the structure of his life collapsed entirely. The fall from being one of English football's most recognizable strikers to a man battling addiction in obscurity was stark and deeply painful. Yet, even at this stage, the final breaking point had not arrived. That moment came in February 1997. Macdonald was arrested for drink driving and found to be 3 times over the legal alcohol limit. It was a humiliating experience, but also a necessary one. Sometimes recovery begins not with hope, but with shock. When he later spoke to his doctor, the message was brutally clear: stop drinking, or you will die. There was no negotiation, no soft reassurance, just truth. At the same time, help arrived from an unexpected place. Mickey Burns, a former Newcastle teammate, learned of Macdonald's condition and refused to look away. Burns contacted the Professional Footballers Association, triggering an intervention that would change everything. The PFA agreed to fund a complex knee replacement, costing £12,000, along with full rehabilitation. It was not charity, it was a recognition that football had a responsibility to one of its own. The surgery itself was an ordeal. Years of damage had hardened the bone to such an extent that the surgeon reportedly buckled to blades during the operation. It was a physical manifestation of everything Macdonald had endured internally. Pain had reshaped his body, just as it had reshaped his life. But this time, the pain had purpose. Recovery was slow and demanding, yet with sobriety came clarity. For the first time in years, Macdonald could imagine a future not entirely defined by suffering. He gave up drinking in 1997 and, remarkably, never went back. One day at a time, he rebuilt himself from the inside out. As his health stabilized, so did his sense of identity. He returned to football, not as a player, but as a voice. Media work gave him structure again, and in the Northeast especially, his honesty and warmth resonated with listeners. He wasn't pretending the past hadn't happened. He spoke openly about pain, addiction, and recovery, offering something rare in football culture: vulnerability. His personal life also found balance. He married for a third time, finding stability with Carol, and slowly rebuilt the emotional foundations that had once crumbled. Life was not perfect, but it was real, grounded, and meaningful. By the time the story came full circle, Malcolm Macdonald had become something more than a former striker. He became proof that collapse does not have to be the end, that even after addiction, bankruptcy, and physical devastation, it is possible to reclaim dignity. As of 2026, he remains deeply respected at both Newcastle United and Arsenal, and his role as president of North Shields FC reflects not just his footballing past, but the life he rebuilt. Malcolm Macdonald's story is not about goals or glory. It is about what happens when the cheers stop, when pain replaces purpose, and when a man must decide whether to surrender or fight for himself. His greatest victory did not come on a football pitch. It came quietly, painfully, and bravely in choosing to live. In later reflections, Macdonald often spoke about how silence was one of the most dangerous parts of his downfall. During his worst years, people still recognized him, still remembered the goals, but very few truly saw the man underneath. Pride kept him from asking for help, and shame kept others from asking the right questions. Football, especially in his era, did not encourage openness about pain that couldn't be shaken, or for toughness. That silence almost cost him his life. He also acknowledged how different his experience might have been had modern player welfare systems existed earlier. Today, conversations about mental health, post-retirement planning, and long-term injury care are far more common. For players like Macdonald, those conversations came decades too late. He became part of a forgotten generation, men who gave their bodies to the game and were left to deal with the consequences alone once their usefulness ended. Despite everything, Macdonald never allowed bitterness to define him. He could speak honestly about the failures of the system while still expressing deep love for football itself. The game, in his eyes, was not the enemy. The lack of preparation for life after it was. This distinction mattered to him because football had given him joy, belonging, and unforgettable moments, even if it also took more than it gave in the end. One of the most powerful changes after his surgery was the return of simple pleasures: being able to walk without crippling pain, to sit without bracing himself for agony, to sleep without waking in distress. These were victories that meant more than applause ever had. Recovery taught him gratitude for things he once took for granted, grounding him in a quieter but more sustainable happiness. Macdonald's sobriety also reshaped how he viewed responsibility. He never framed his addiction as someone else's fault. He accepted his choices while also acknowledging the circumstances that pushed him there. That balance made his story resonate with people far beyond football fans. Listeners who had never seen him play recognized themselves in his struggle and his refusal to give up. As a broadcaster, he brought empathy to his commentary. He understood pressure, fear, and vulnerability in ways statistics could never explain. When players struggled with form or confidence, he spoke with compassion rather than judgment. That tone set him apart and earned him respect not just as a former player, but as a human voice in a sport often dominated by criticism. His relationship with fans also changed. Where once he had been admired for goals and bravado, he was now respected for honesty. Supporters who met him later in life often spoke about his warmth and openness, about a man who had nothing left to prove. He listened as much as he spoke, aware that survival had taught him humility. There was a quiet symbolism in his continued connection to clubs like Newcastle and Arsenal. These were places where he had been celebrated, but also places that represented a younger version of himself, unaware of what lay ahead. Remaining involved was not about nostalgia. It was about belonging, about closing the loop between who he was and who he became. Macdonald's life story ultimately challenges the idea that success is linear. Fame, money, and admiration did not protect him from pain, nor did failure prevent redemption. His journey shows that identity built on one role footballer, star hero, can collapse, but identity rebuilt on honesty and resilience can endure. In the end, Malcolm Macdonald's legacy is not defined by how hard he fell, but by the fact that he stood back up when the odds were stacked against him. His story is a reminder that recovery is rarely dramatic. It is slow, uncomfortable, and deeply personal. but it is possible. And sometimes, the most important wins happen long after the final whistle.
George Best was a diamond. There was a little flaw there.
Right from the start, people, I think, knew that George had got something a bit special about him.
He was such an unbelievably gifted player. He had a quality and he had a control that really was unparalleled, really.
Good looking, a bit like the Beatles, that hairstyle, etc.
Before we begin, if you enjoy deep football stories that explore the lives of legends beyond the pitch, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this aren't just about goals or trophies, they are about the human side of the game, the triumphs and tragedies that shape players in ways the public rarely sees. George Best's life is one of those stories, a story of genius and self-destruction, brilliance and heartbreak, and a cautionary tale that still resonates decades later. George Best arrived in football as if born to play it. From the streets of Belfast to the lights of Old Trafford, he moved with a grace and confidence that made even the most experienced defenders look helpless. He was electric, unpredictable, and almost untouchable, a winger whose talent seemed effortless, whose balance and speed, combined with an uncanny footballing intelligence. Watching him was watching art in motion. By the age of 22, he had already won the Ballon d'Or, lifted the European Cup with Manchester United, and cemented his place as one of the brightest stars in world football. But brilliance, as Best would come to learn, can come with a price. The pressures of fame and adoration were not something Best managed easily. Despite his extraordinary talent, he described himself as pathologically shy, a man ill-equipped to navigate the glare of the public eye. London's nightclubs offered an escape from that pressure, a place where he could be anonymous, or at least feel he was. It was in these venues that he began to form the habits that would eventually derail his career. The crowds and accolades that cheered for his footballing genius did not soothe his insecurities. They amplified them. By 1974, at just 27 years old, George Best walked away from top-flight football. Manchester United, where he had achieved legendary status, was no longer the place he could thrive. His talent had never dimmed, but the demands of professional life clashed with his personal demons. His addiction had begun to take root, growing quietly at first, then with alarming speed. From the outside, it may have seemed like nightlife and indulgence, but for Best, it was the beginning of a long descent. The years that followed were marked by movement and instability. Best played for 11 different clubs across the United States, South Africa, Ireland, Scotland, and Australia. Each stop offered fleeting glimpses of the player who once mesmerized the world, but consistency eluded him. The magic remained in brief flashes, a dazzling dribble here, a stunning goal there, but the life of a wandering footballer replaced the promise of greatness that had seemed inevitable. Fans who had once seen him dominate European football now caught glimpses of the shadow of that brilliance. Financial ruin soon followed the instability of his career. Best's lifestyle famously summed up in his own words as, "I spent a lot of money on booze, birds, and fast cars. The rest I just squandered. Caught up with him. The fortune he earned in his youth evaporated through extravagance, addiction, and mismanagement. He eventually faced bankruptcy and lost the modernist home he had built in Manchester, a symbol not just of his wealth, but of the life that his talent could have sustained. Had his habits been different, alcohol became a constant companion, a tool to dull the pain of fame, expectation, and the emptiness that can follow professional success at a young age. But it also became his undoing. Best's addiction led to a series of public controversies, legal battles, and personal conflicts that kept him in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. In 1984, he was sentenced to 12 weeks in prison for drink driving and assaulting a police officer. He spent Christmas that year in Pentonville prison, an experience that symbolized just how far from the pitch and from control his life had slipped. The public saw the downward spiral, and it was impossible to ignore. Best made several infamous appearances on television, most notably on The Wogan Show in 1990, where his behavior was erratic and fueled by alcohol. These moments, though sometimes played for laughs by the media, masked deep pain and isolation. His relationships suffered. His marriages ended in divorce, first to Angie MacDonald Janes and later to Alex Percy, each failing under the weight of addiction and instability. By the turn of the millennium, the toll on his health was undeniable. Years of heavy drinking left his liver functioning at only 20% by 2000, and a life-saving transplant became unavoidable. In July 2002, George Best underwent a liver transplant, a procedure that offered hope, but also a stark reminder of the cost of his lifestyle. Friends, doctors, and fans hoped that the operation would mark a turning point, a chance for Best to rebuild, to regain control over his life. Yet addiction is relentless. Despite the dire warnings from medical professionals that another drink could be fatal, Best relapsed less than a year after his transplant. The pattern of brilliance and self-destruction, which had defined his playing career, now defined his personal life. It was a tragic cycle, moments of hope followed by moments of loss, each relapse a reminder that genius alone cannot save a man from himself. In November 2005, George Best, fully aware of his impending death, made one final act of honesty and public service. He requested a photograph of himself in his hospital bed be published, accompanied by the stark warning, "Don't die like me." It was a candid acknowledgement not just of his mortality, but of the consequences of choices unchecked by moderation. It was both a confession and a plea, a message for anyone who might idolize talent, but ignore its cost. In November 2005, George Best, fully aware of his impending death, made one final act of honesty and public service. He requested a photograph of himself in his hospital bed be published, accompanied by the stark warning, "Don't die like me." It was a candid acknowledgement not just of his mortality, but of the consequences of choices unchecked by moderation. It was both a confession and a plea, a message for anyone who might idolize talent, but ignore its cost. Best passed away on November 25th, 2005, at the age of 59 due to multiple organ failure and lung infection. The footballing world mourned not only the loss of a player, but the loss of potential unfulfilled, of years and moments stolen by addiction. Yet even in death, his story continues to resonate, serving as both inspiration for his talent and a cautionary tale about the price of excess. George Best's legacy is unique because it exists in duality. On one hand, he remains a footballing genius, a player whose skill and creativity continue to captivate fans and inspire new generations. On the other hand, his life is a warning about the fragility of human behavior when genius and personal demons collide. He reminds us that talent, while extraordinary, is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Despite the tragedy, Best's story is not without light. He became an emblem of honesty about addiction and the pressures that come with fame. His public warnings, his willingness to share his struggles, and his continued presence in football culture after retirement contribute to a fuller understanding of the costs of stardom. He was never just a footballer. He was a human being, brilliant and flawed, admired and tragic. Even now, decades after his death, George Best's name carries weight. In Manchester, Belfast, and across the footballing world, people remember the genius on the pitch, the balance, the dribbling, the moments of sheer magic. They also remember the cautionary tale, the man who lived at the edge, who danced with brilliance and disaster alike, and who ultimately left a message for all of us about the fragility of life and the perils of indulgence. His life forces fans and historians alike to reconcile two truths: that he was one of the greatest footballers ever to grace the game, and that greatness alone cannot shield one from the consequences of human weakness. That duality is precisely why George Best remains endlessly fascinating, endlessly discussed, and endlessly remembered. In the end, George Best's story is a lesson in contrast. Talent without discipline, fame without stability, and brilliance without boundaries can create a life as legendary for its cautionary aspects as it is for its glory. His name will forever be synonymous with genius, charisma, and tragedy, a reminder that football, like life, is a game where brilliance and vulnerability often walk hand in hand. Even as his health deteriorated, George Best remained a public figure who fascinated fans around the world. He had a charisma that transcended football, a charm that made him a star in the nightclub scene, on television, and in the tabloids. People were drawn not only to his ability on the pitch, but to the allure of his lifestyle: the fast cars, fashionable clothes, and glamorous companions. For many, Best represented both aspiration and warning, the heights of fame paired with the vulnerabilities that come with it. Despite his self-destructive tendencies, Best often maintained an extraordinary sense of humor about his own life. His quips about spending money on booze, birds, and fast cars weren't just a reflection of his excesses. They were also a candid acknowledgement of human frailty. He seemed aware that his lifestyle was unsustainable, yet he also understood that the world loved the myth more than the man behind it. That self-awareness, combined with charm, kept the public fascinated even as his personal life unraveled. Relationships were another area where Best's brilliance and flaws collided. His marriages ended in divorce, and romantic entanglements were frequent and widely covered in the press. These relationships were complicated by his addiction, his fame, and his deep need for approval. Friends and former teammates have often remarked that while he could be loyal and generous, he could also be distant or self-absorbed, traits amplified by the pressures of stardom and the chaotic lifestyle he led off the pitch. Teammates had a complex relationship with Best. On one hand, they recognized his unmatched talent. On the other, they were sometimes frustrated by his unpredictability and lack of discipline. Yet, many have described him as someone who could lift an entire squad with a moment of brilliance, a perfectly timed pass, or a stunning goal. Even those who criticized him privately admitted that when he played at his best, no one else on the pitch came close to matching his skill and instinct. Media appearances often highlighted the duality of Best's public persona. In interviews and television shows, he could be charming, witty, and approachable, yet the shadow of alcoholism was never far behind. His infamous Wogan appearance in 1990 remains a defining moment, capturing both the allure and tragedy of the man. Millions watched as he oscillated between humor and erratic behavior, embodying the contradictions that defined his life: genius and fragility, confidence and insecurity, brilliance and self-destruction. The liver transplant in 2002 was both a literal and symbolic turning point. It represented a chance at survival, a brief opportunity to reclaim control over a life that had long felt chaotic. Yet, the relapse following the surgery highlighted the depth of addiction and the difficulty of escape from long-established patterns. Best's struggle after the transplant demonstrated that even life-saving interventions could not simply erase decades of entrenched habits and consequences. As George Best's story has been recounted over the years, it has also become a cautionary tale for younger players and fans. Clubs, pundits, and supporters often point to his life when discussing the importance of mental health, self-care, and the pressures that come with early fame. His story is referenced not to diminish his genius, but to emphasize that extraordinary talent requires discipline, support, and balance if it is to endure. Even after his death, Best's influence on football culture remains profound. Players and fans still speak of him as an icon of creativity, unpredictability, and individual brilliance, yet his life off the pitch is inseparable from his legacy, a reminder that footballers are human beings first, and that the cost of fame can be devastating. The narrative of his life now includes lessons as well as legends, merging admiration with caution in a way few sports figures can claim. Modern tributes continue to celebrate his talent while acknowledging the tragedy. Statues, murals, and documentaries honor his contributions to Manchester United and Northern Ireland, yet they are paired with narratives about addiction, struggle, and resilience. These memorials serve as a reminder that Best's life cannot be neatly categorized into victories and defeats. It was complex, layered, and emblematic of the human experience. Ultimately, George Best's story is enduring because it resonates on multiple levels. He was a prodigy who dazzled millions, a man who lived without boundaries, and a person whose personal struggles were as visible as his footballing triumphs. His life forces us to reconcile brilliance with vulnerability, talent with imperfection, and fame with consequence. In remembering George Best, we celebrate a genius who could inspire awe with a single touch of the ball, while also learning from a cautionary tale that echoes far beyond football.
Even outside the Crown Court where he stands trial, autograph hunters want his signature. But today Paul Gascoigne had to listen to the account of a woman who says that sharing a train carriage with him on the way home from work turned into a sexual assault. She described seeing him clearly intoxicated, surrounded by empty drinks cans and his face smeared with food in the seat behind hers on a train between York and Durham, until the point he got up and sat on her.
Paul Gascoigne's story after his playing days is one of contradiction, vulnerability, public misunderstanding, and repeated collisions with the law, all set against the backdrop of a man whose personal boundaries often dissolved under pressure, addiction, and lifelong emotional fragility. To understand the legal allegations that followed him into later life, it is important to see them not as isolated headlines, but as moments in a long, messy struggle involving fame, alcohol, mental health, and a personality that never adapted to ordinary social limits once football stopped protecting him. Before we go any further, if you enjoy deep, honest football stories that go beyond the pitch and into the real lives of legends, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel grow, and it means you won't miss stories like this in the future. By the time Gascoigne reached his 40s and 50s, his reputation as a troubled genius had already been firmly established. His same openness and impulsiveness that once made him beloved by teammates and fans became dangerous in everyday life. He lived without filters, without structure, and often without the self-awareness needed to navigate public spaces safely. This would repeatedly land him in situations that escalated into legal trouble, especially when alcohol was involved. The most high-profile allegation came in 2018, an incident that instantly reignited public debate about Gascoigne's behavior, accountability, and whether his past struggles explained too much or excused too little. In August of that year, Gascoigne was traveling on a train from York to Newcastle. Witnesses later described him as intoxicated, loud, and seeking attention, behavior that had become sadly familiar to those who had followed his post-football life. During the journey, Gascoigne approached a woman sitting nearby and kissed her without consent. The prosecution described the act as forceful and sloppy, emphasizing that the woman was shocked, distressed, and humiliated in a confined public space where she could not easily escape. The moment was brief, but the impact was immediate. Police were called and Gascoigne was arrested when the train arrived at Dereham railway station. As news of the arrest spread, headlines were swift and unforgiving. For many, it seemed like confirmation of a narrative that had followed Gascoigne for decades: immense talent, destroyed by alcohol, now spiraling into increasingly unacceptable behavior. Others urged caution, pointing out that allegations were not convictions, and that Gascoigne's mental state had long been unstable. Gascoigne's defense rested on intent, awareness, and context. He did not deny kissing the woman, but strongly denied any sexual motive. He told the court that he believed the woman had been insulted by another passenger, claiming someone had called her fat and ugly. According to Gascoigne, the kiss was meant as a misguided attempt to comfort her and boost her confidence. It was, he argued, inappropriate but not sexual. His legal team reinforced this explanation by highlighting Gascoigne's personality. They described him as a tactile individual, someone who had always expressed affection physically without fully understanding boundaries. Former teammates and acquaintances testified that hugging, touching, and spontaneous gestures had always been part of his social behavior. For better or worse, alcohol played a central role in the case. Gascoigne admitted he had been drinking heavily, something that weakened his judgment and awareness. However, the defense argued that intoxication did not automatically equate to sexual intent. The case therefore hinged on whether the kiss was sexual assault under the law or an ill-judged non-sexual act carried out without malice. In October 2019, after a full trial at Teesside Crown Court, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Gascoigne was found not guilty of sexual assault. He was also cleared of an alternative lesser charge of assault by beating. The jury accepted that, while the act was inappropriate, the prosecution had failed to prove sexual intent beyond reasonable doubt. Gascoigne left the courtroom visibly emotional. For him, the verdict was not just legal relief but personal vindication. He insisted that he was not a sexual predator and that the accusation had deeply affected his already fragile mental health. Supporters echoed this sentiment, arguing that the legal system had done its job and reached the correct conclusion. However, the acquittal did not erase the broader questions surrounding his behavior. Many observers acknowledged that while Gascoigne had been cleared under criminal law, his actions still reflected a lack of boundaries that continued to place him and others at risk. The case became less about guilt and more about responsibility, self-control, and whether Gascoigne was capable of change. This was not the first time Gascoigne had found himself in court. 3 years earlier, in 2015, he pleaded guilty to harassment involving his former partner, Amanda Thomas. Unlike the 2018 case, this incident did not end in acquittal or ambiguity. Gascoigne admitted wrongdoing, and the court record left little room for interpretation. The harassment charge stemmed from a series of abusive text messages and tweets sent over several days in March 2015. The messages were described as aggressive, relentless, and distressing. They came during a period when Gascoigne was heavily drinking and emotionally unstable. Following the breakdown of the relationship, Ms. Thomas told the court that the messages left her fearful and anxious, unsure when the next outburst would come. Gascoigne's behavior crossed a legal threshold from personal conflict into criminal harassment, and he accepted responsibility by pleading guilty. The court fined Gascoigne £100, ordered him to pay £1,000 in compensation to Ms. Thomas, and imposed a 2-year restraining order banning any form of contact. The relatively light financial penalty reflected his limited income at the time, but the restraining order was a clear statement that his behavior was unacceptable. During the same 2015 proceedings, Gascoigne also pleaded guilty to common assault, following an altercation with photographer Stephen Shepherd. The incident occurred when Gascoigne, irritated and intoxicated, lashed out after feeling harassed by media attention. It was another example of how poorly he handled confrontation outside the structured environment of football. These incidents reinforced a recurring pattern. Gascoigne struggled with boundaries, reacted emotionally to perceived slights, and often turned to alcohol, which amplified every flaw. Each episode added to a growing legal record that contrasted painfully with the joyful, carefree image many fans still clung to. In 2013, Gascoigne had already been fined for assaulting a railway guard and being drunk and disorderly at Stevenage railway station. The incident involved verbal abuse and physical aggression, once again in a public transport setting. Alcohol was again a central factor, and Gascoigne admitted he had lost control that by 2016. The pattern extended into public appearances. During an Evening with Gadza show in Wolverhampton, Gascoigne used racially aggravated abusive language while on stage. The comments shocked the audience and quickly spread through media coverage. Gascoigne later pleaded guilty and was fined £1,000. That incident was particularly damaging because it contradicted the inclusive, emotional image many fans associated with him. Gascoigne apologized, blaming alcohol and poor judgment, but the damage to his public standing was real. It also demonstrated how unpredictable his behavior had become when performing unscripted in front of crowds. Taken together, these cases paint a complicated picture. Gascoigne is neither the monster some headlines suggested nor a harmless clown misunderstood by society. He is a deeply flawed individual whose lack of boundaries, addiction, and emotional instability repeatedly spilled into the legal system. What makes Gascoigne's story especially tragic is that many of these incidents were preventable. Former teammates and support workers have repeatedly said that when sober, he is gentle, generous, and painfully aware of his own failings. But sobriety has been fragile, and relapse has often reopened the door to chaos. The 2018 acquittal stands as an important reminder of the difference between legal guilt and public judgment. Gascoigne was cleared because the evidence did not meet the criminal standard, not because the behavior was appropriate. That distinction is often lost in public debate, but it matters. For Gascoigne himself, the case became another emotional scar. He spoke openly afterward about how close he had come to despair, saying the trial made him feel like his entire life was on trial, not just one moment on a train. For a man already haunted by regret, it was another heavy burden. In later interviews, Gascoigne acknowledged that even when cleared, he needed to change. He admitted that his understanding of personal space and consent was outdated and shaped by an era when his status protected him. Whether that realization leads to lasting change remains an open question. Paul Gascoigne's legal history cannot be separated from his humanity. It is the story of someone who never learned how to be ordinary, who lived too long in the spotlight without the tools to survive outside it. Each court case is less a scandal in isolation and more a chapter in a life that never truly found balance. His legacy remains painfully divided. On the pitch, he is remembered as one of the most gifted footballers England has ever produced. Off it, he is a cautionary tale about fame without support, talent without structure, and vulnerability exposed to the harshest public glare. Gascoigne's story forces uncomfortable questions about responsibility, compassion, and accountability. It asks whether society knows how to help its fallen heroes, or whether it only knows how to judge them once they fall. In that tension lies the true tragedy of Paul Gascoigne's post-football life. Even now, years after many of these cases faded from the headlines, Gascoigne remains a figure people argue about rather than simply remember. Some see him as a man repeatedly forgiven because of his footballing brilliance, while others see someone who has been punished publicly far more than most for behavior rooted in illness and addiction. That split reflects how uncomfortable society still is when trying to balance empathy with accountability, especially when the person involved is famous. What is undeniable is that Gascoigne's encounters with the legal system often acted as warning flares rather than turning points. Each incident briefly forced reflection, apologies, and promises of change, but sustained stability proved elusive. The absence of long-term structure after retirement, combined with lingering mental health issues, meant that lessons were learned, painfully slowly if at all, in recent years. Those close to Gascoigne have spoken about a quieter, more reflective version of him emerging at times, aware of the damage done and genuinely fearful of repeating past mistakes. Whether this represents lasting growth or simply another calm between storms is something only time can answer. His life has taught fans that redemption is rarely a straight line, especially for someone who has lived so publicly and so chaotically. Ultimately, Paul Gascoigne's legal troubles are not the defining feature of his life, but they are inseparable from it. They reveal a man trapped between who he was celebrated for being and who he struggled to become afterward. His story endures not because it is neat or inspiring, but because it is painfully human, messy, and unresolved, much like Gascoigne himself.